This is a review of the female reproductive system. Here in a sagittal view, we can see the pelvic organs and the external genitalia. We'll start with the gonad, which is the ovary. The ovary sits in the lateral aspect of the pelvic cavity, so you're looking at a parasagittal view. The fimbriae of the uterine tube come in contact with the ovary and help capture the eggs that are released by ovulation. The uterine tube connects the ovary to the uterus. The uterus is a thick muscular organ with a narrow internal cavity. The lower portion of the uterus is the cervix. The cervix is the part that projects into the vagina. The vagina surrounds the cervix and has an external opening, the vaginal orifice, which opens into a space between the labia minora. The space is called the vestibule. Inferior to the uterus is the urinary bladder, which is not part of the reproductive system, but certainly sits in very close proximity to it. The external urethral orifice also opens into the vestibule. Notice the urogenital diaphragm, which is the muscular pelvic floor. It connects to the pubic symphysis, which is overlain by a pad of fat called the mons pubis. Mons pubis external skin is continuous with the labium majus. You remember from our last review that the labia majora in the female correspond to the scrotal sac in the male. This is an anterior view of a dissected specimen. Here again you can see the relationship between the urinary bladder and the uterus. You can also see that the uterus is anchored by the round ligament of the uterus. It parallels the uterine tubes. Here sit the ovaries, so the uterine tube curls around. The fimbriae of the uterine tubes are closely associated with the ovary. In this specimen, they've been pulled back. The broad ligament is a sheet-like membrane that helps anchor not only the uterus, but also the other female reproductive organs within the pelvic cavity. Here you can see the broad ligament. The broad ligament is continuous with the ligaments that connect to the ovary, the uterine tube, and the blood supply. The ovarian artery and vein, remember, connect to the aorta and the inferior vena cava, respectively. As they run in towards the ovary, they are surrounded by a thickened layer called the suspensory ligament. Additionally, there is an ovarian ligament that connects the ovary to the wall of the uterus. And if you look at this sectional view, you can see that the regions of the broad ligament that are associated with the uterine tube and the ovary itself are extensions called the mesosalpinx and the mesovarium. The regions of the uterine tube are visible here. The uterine tube connects from the uterus to the ovary. At its end, closest to the ovary, it broadens into a region called the infundibulum, which ends in the fimbriae, the finger-like projections that help capture the egg. Here again you can see the round ligaments, and here is the ureter. The cervix projects into the vaginal canal. The opening into the uterine cavity is called the external os. In this diagram we're looking at the stages of the ovarian cycle. You should think of this as like time-lapse photography. We're seeing a lot of stages in one view that would not all coexist at the same time. Most of the eggs in the ovary are in the form of primordial follicles. At birth, the primordial follicles have already formed and are found mostly in the margin of the ovary. Each primordial follicle contains an enlarged primary oocyte, which is in the stage of suspended animation and surrounded by a very thin layer of cuboidal epithelial cells called follicle cells. Once a female hits puberty, a few eggs every month start to develop. The earliest stages of development are called the primary follicles. In this stage, the egg cell itself, the oocyte, enlarges, and the follicle cells start to divide and produce a stratified cuboidal epithelium, thickening the wall of the follicle. These cells are called granulosa cells. In any given month, there may be multiple secondary follicles. The secondary follicle can be distinguished from the primary follicle by the presence of the antrum. The antrum is a hollow space formed as the granulosa cells start to secrete a fluid called the follicular fluid. Notice that the egg is still attached to the wall of the follicle by some anchoring granulosa cells. The outer layer of the follicle is a layer of connective tissue. These cells are called thecal cells. They form the theca, or shield, outer layer of the follicle. In any given month, only one follicle will mature. Occasionally two might mature, but in human females, typically only one follicle will mature each month. The mature follicle is quite large. The antrum has expanded considerably. The primary oocyte will divide by meiosis I to form a secondary oocyte. This will happen hours before ovulation. The layer of jelly-like material around the oocyte, the zona pellucida, is quite pronounced, and the cells that surround the zona are referred to as the corona radiata. The entire egg-bearing heap, the whole connected portion here, is called the cumulus oophorus. So again, the corona radiata is just the layer of cells around the egg. The cumulus oophorus is that plus the cells that anchor it into the follicle wall. You can clearly see the granulosa layer and the theca. Ovulation occurs usually at the midpoint of the cycle. In a typical 28-day cycle, that will be on day 14. Notice that the corona radiata and zona pellucida are ovulated out along with the secondary oocyte. The follicle that's left behind will rapidly transform itself into a structure called the corpus luteum. The cells of the corpus luteum are still distinct cells, even though they're not drawn that way here. They do accumulate a lot of lipid materials to help them make the steroid hormones, estrogens and progesterone, and so they really do take on a yellow appearance, but they are still cellular in nature. The corpus luteum will enlarge. It only lasts, though, for about 10 to 12 days, and then it will rapidly shrink down into a corpus albicans, which will get smaller and smaller until it's just a little tiny body of scar tissue. Here we can see the stages of oogenesis, the meiosis and development of the oocyte, alongside the stages of the follicle. We use some of the same terminology, you just have to keep it straight. The oogonium is parallel to the spermatogonium in males. In a female, all the oogonia have finished their division, so that by the time a little girl is born, all of the oogonia have already specialized into primary oocytes. Again, they stay in sort of a stage of arrested development at prophase 1. This protects the DNA from degradation. In childhood, not much is going on. At the onset of puberty every month, one or a few of the primary oocytes will be stimulated to complete meiosis I. This will happen only in the mature follicle. So as we go through the stages of the follicle, from the primordial follicles to the primary follicles, to the secondary follicles, to the mature follicles, only at the stage of the mature follicle will you finally get to the point where you're finishing meiosis I. And what is ovulated is the secondary oocyte. Notice that there's an unequal division of cytoplasm, so that this smaller cell is really just a cell fragment. It's called the first polar body, and its job really is just to get rid of half of the chromosomes and allow that oocyte to remain this especially large cell. That cell is large because it's packing a lot of nutrients for the earliest stages of embryonic development. So what's ovulated is a secondary oocyte. It's ovulated from a mature follicle, called here a vesicular follicle. That's just another name. After ovulation, if and only if the oocyte is fertilized by a sperm cell, will it be stimulated to undergo meiosis II. So once the sperm nucleus penetrates the egg cell, then the egg cell nucleus will finish meiosis and become an ovum. And officially, an ovum is already fertilized. This is true in humans, but not in all animals. As a result of meiosis II, we have another unequal division. The second polar body is produced along with a still very large cell called the ovum. This will go on to develop into the embryo. We'll cover that in another lesson. And of course, in the meantime, after ovulation, the follicle develops into a corpus luteum, which then degenerates into a corpus albicans. We'll take a brief look at the hormonal changes that correspond to the female cycle. Ovulation is kind of a benchmark day. Ovulation typically is on day 14. Please notice that on day 13 we get a surge in the level of hormones from the pituitary. These are FSH and LH hormones. So they surge the day before ovulation and trigger ovulation. The surge in FSH and LH is probably due to this increase in estrogen that has occurred while the follicle was developing. The granulosa cells of the follicle secrete estrogen, and as the estrogen levels rise, that rise in estrogen levels will trigger the secretion of FSH and LH, which in turn trigger ovulation. At about that time, estrogen levels peak and fall. They'll recover again as the corpus luteum develops. Notice that after ovulation, we're also producing progesterone. Progesterone in combination with estrogen has very different effects than the effects of estrogen alone in the first part of the cycle. It's easiest to refer to the ovarian cycle in terms of the date of ovulation, so this is called the pre-ovulatory phase, and this is the post-ovulatory phase. In the uterus, we measure the phases based on the condition of the endometrial lining. The endometrium has two layers, a basal layer, which persists all the time, and a functional layer, which grows and then is shed off in the menstrual flow. We generally mark the first day of a new cycle by the first day of the menstrual phase. So the old functional layer of the endometrium is shed in the menstrual flow. That's usually about 5 to 7 days. And then in the proliferative phase, the basal layer is replacing the functional layer that was shed in the last cycle. After ovulation, the combination of progesterone and estrogen causes an increase in the functionality of these endometrial glands. And this is called the secretory phase because these glands are secreting a nutritive fluid which will help the conceptus implant. The hypothalamus in the female regulates the reproductive hormones the same as it does in the male. However, in the female there is generally a 28-day cycle. That cycle is regulated by factors which we do not completely understand, but the hypothalamus secretes the GnRH hormone in a burst about every 28 days, and that GnRH burst will cause the secretion of FSH and LH. FSH and LH initially will be secreted at low levels. That will stimulate the development of the primordial follicles into mature follicles. The follicle stage occurs as estrogen levels are being secreted. Those estrogen levels feed back to the hypothalamus and to the pituitary and cause the pituitary cells that produce LH to increase their production. But only when the estrogen levels are very high will you get a surge in LH, which will then trigger ovulation. The production of progesterone, estrogen, and a third hormone, inhibin, from the corpus luteum will provide the negative feedback control to the hypothalamus. Inhibin and estrogen will also provide negative feedback control during the follicular phase. Here you can see a sectional view of the wall of the vagina. It has a mucous membrane because it opens to the exterior environment. The epithelium is a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, very similar to what you see in the esophagus. Deep folds between the epithelium and the lamina propria to help anchor the epithelial layer, and a muscular layer. Finally, we'll turn our attention to the mammary glands, a structure in the female which has no functional equivalent in the male. Functional tissue in the mammary gland is the alveoli. Alveoli are the milk-producing cells. They're divided into lobules. Lobules are organized into lobes so that each lobe has a single duct which empties out through its lactiferous sinus on the surface of the nipple. The areola is the pigmented area around the nipple. It has a series of glands which help to lubricate the skin. The suspensory ligaments help to maintain the normal position of the mammary tissue.